"I'll go." Rowena Voss said it quietly. The way you say something when the decision is already made and saying it out loud is just the last formality. Her mother didn't respond. Her father looked at the window. The lamp between them was burning low and nobody moved to turn it up. The man sitting across the table was named Cutter Drain. She had seen him once before, at the grain exchange in Harwick, moving through the crowd the way tall men do when they are used to people stepping aside. She hadn't known his name then. She hadn't needed to. She was 24 years old, and she had believed until 3 days ago that her life was going to look like something she recognized. She was wrong about that. The trouble had started with the drought the first year, and then the note her father took out with the merchant's bank, when the creek ran low and the wheat didn't come up, and then the second drought the year after, and then her brother's medical bills, and then the third season of nothing, and the way nothing stacks on top of nothing, until it becomes something very large and very immovable. Debt has a way of becoming permanent if you wait long enough to address it. The Voss family had waited. Cutter Drain owned the largest sheep operation in the Kettle Basin. He had come to their door on a Tuesday and sat down in their kitchen with his hat off and said, plainly and without theater, that he was prepared to clear what they owed if Rowena would consent to marry him. He needed someone who could manage the domestic side of a working ranch. His previous housekeeper had left to care for her ailing sister, and the operation had been struggling without that management for going on 5 months. He didn't say he needed a wife. He said he needed someone capable. Rowena's father had explained this to her in the particular voice he used for things he had already decided, and was only now finding the words to announce. Her mother had cried once, quietly, and then stopped. Rowena had not cried at all. She had gone to the kitchen and stood with her hands on the counter and looked at the wall for a long time. Then she went back in and sat down across from Cutter Drain and said, "Tell me what this actually means." He told her. She listened. He was direct, which she hadn't expected. He didn't dress it up. He told her she would have her own room, her own space, the full authority of the household. He told her she could refuse and there would be no consequence to her family. He told her the arrangement would be a business arrangement. Nothing more unless she decided otherwise. "You're telling me you won't." She stopped. Started again. "You're not expecting a wife in full." "I'm not expecting anything you haven't agreed to give," he said. And something in the way he said it, flat and unembellished, like a man who found the alternative not only distasteful but genuinely confusing, made her feel something shift slightly in her chest. She didn't say yes that night. She asked him to come back the following morning. She spent that night the way she'd spent most hard nights since she was 17, sitting at the kitchen table after everyone else had gone to bed, working through the problem in front of her, until it stopped feeling like a problem and started feeling like a set of facts she could navigate. Emotion wasn't useful in those hours. Practicality was. The facts were these. Her family owed more than they could repay in the next 10 years. Her father was 58, and his back was going. Her mother's hands were already failing. Her brother Theo needed a doctor in the city, not the county surgeon who'd done what he could and said plainly that more was needed. And Rowena herself had 24 years of hard work behind her and a clear understanding of her own competence, which was the only thing she owned free and clear. The man was not a bad man. She didn't know that yet with any certainty, but she felt it in the way you feel things when you've been reading people your whole life out of necessity. He had looked at her father without contempt. He had not looked at her like a transaction. In the morning she said yes. The wedding was a small thing at the county clerk's office with her parents present and a circuit preacher her mother had contacted who agreed to say the appropriate words over a copy of the legal form. Cutter wore a clean shirt. Rowena wore her gray dress because it was her best one and it fit properly. He didn't make a speech. He didn't seem nervous. He seemed like a man completing a serious piece of business with the gravity it deserved, which was, she had already started to understand, how he seemed about most things. The ring was plain silver, thinner than she expected, which for some reason made her feel better about it. She hugged her mother in the doorway. She shook her father's hand, because anything more would have broken something she was working hard to keep intact. She picked up her own bag before Cutter could reach for it, which made him pause and look at her, and she looked back at him steadily. "I can carry my own things," she said. "I can see that," he said, and stepped back, and that was the end of that. The drive to Kettle Basin took most of the afternoon. They didn't talk much, but what talk there was felt honest. He pointed out landmarks when they were relevant. He told her the names of the two hands she'd meet when they arrived. He told her the cook had quit in March and he'd been managing on whatever cord and the other hand could put together, which was not going well. "What does that mean?" she asked. "It means there's been a lot of salted meat and not enough of anything else," he said. She looked at the road ahead. "I can cook," she said. "I know," he said. "That's not why I asked you." She turned to look at him. He was watching the horses. "You asked me because you needed someone who could manage the whole house," she said. "I asked you because your father's neighbor told me you'd kept that farm solvent for 3 seasons through conditions that broke every other operation in the county," he said. "And because your father talked about you the way men only talk about people they've genuinely admired." Rowena looked at the road. She didn't say anything. Something was happening in her chest that she didn't entirely have words for, so she let it sit there unnamed and looked at the landscape moving past. Kettle Basin was larger than she'd been told. The house was, too. Not fancy, nothing like that, but solid, built to last, the kind of construction that tells you the person who put it up meant to stay. There were curtains in the front room, which surprised her until she looked closely and saw they were gray with dust and the wrong length for the window. Whoever had hung them hadn't known what they were doing or hadn't cared, which told her something about the domestic situation she was walking into. The two hands, a man named Fenn and a younger man called Price, were in the yard when they pulled in. They took off their hats when she stepped down from the wagon, which she noted as a point in Cutter's favor. He had either told them to or hired men who already knew to. Her room was clean. Someone had put fresh linens on the bed, stiffly folded, which meant a woman from a neighboring property or someone who'd been paid to come in and do it once. There was a small window that looked out toward the east slope of the basin, and in the late afternoon light the view was, despite everything, genuinely beautiful. She stood in the middle of that room for about 30 seconds. Then she unpacked her bag and went to find the kitchen. The kitchen told her everything she needed to know about the last 5 months. The stores were adequate, but organized by a person with no system. The cast iron was good quality, poorly seasoned. The herbs had been left to dry out and weren't usable. There was coffee, which was the first encouraging thing she'd found, and a cured ham hanging from the rafters that hadn't been touched in a way that told her no one in this household was eating properly. She made dinner that first night: ham, potatoes from the root cellar, biscuits from what flour she could find that wasn't stale, and set it on the table at 6 o'clock. Cutter came in at exactly 6, which told her he was a man who kept to a schedule, and he stopped in the doorway when he saw the table set properly and said nothing for a moment. "There were biscuits," she told him. "I don't know if they're good. I didn't have much to work with." "There have been no biscuits since March," he said, and sat down. They ate across from each other in a silence that was careful but not hostile. "Halfway through," he said, "Fenn mentioned you asked him about the livestock rotation this afternoon." "I wanted to understand the operation," she said. "If I'm managing the supply ordering and the accounts, I need to understand what the supply needs are." He looked at her over his coffee cup. "I said household accounts. Household and ranch accounts are the same accounts," she said. "You can't manage one without understanding the other." He put his coffee down. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read, but that had something in it that felt like reassessment, like a person adjusting an estimate. "All right," he said. "What are the current debts outstanding?" she asked. He told her. She listened. The picture was more complex than she'd expected, but not unmanageable. She started, without thinking, to run the numbers in her head, and she must have been doing something visible with her face because he said, "What?" "Your grain contract," she said. "How long have you been with the same supplier?" 7 years. Have you renegotiated in that time?" "A beat." "No, you should," she said. 7 years is leverage. You're paying a rate that was appropriate when you started. It isn't appropriate now." She picked up her coffee. "I'll look at the invoices tomorrow." He said nothing. He looked at her with that same expression. Then he went back to his plate. When he stood to take his dishes to the sink, he took hers too. She noticed that the first week was about learning. Rowena approached the ranch the way she approached most unfamiliar things, carefully, methodically, and with a genuine interest in understanding how it worked before she tried to change anything. She watched Fenn and Price. She walked the perimeter of the house. She went through the filing cabinet in the office, which was organized according to a logic that might have made sense to someone once, but didn't anymore. She found the Drain family's original land grant at the back of the third drawer. It was dated 1857. She smoothed it carefully and set it aside, because something about a document that old, that foundational, felt important to keep track of. Cutter was outside from before dawn until the evening, every day, with the particular constancy of a man who doesn't think of work as something separate from himself, but as simply what existence involves. She saw the weight he carried the same way she had seen it in her own father, but different. Her father's weight had bent him forward by the time she was old enough to notice. Cutter's weight had compressed him, made him more dense, less communicative, like a man who'd gotten so accustomed to bearing things alone that the idea of setting any of it down had simply stopped occurring to him. She didn't say anything about this. She was new here. She was still learning. The incident with the sheep was 10 days in. One of the western pasture fences had given way in the night and a section of the flock had gotten out onto the neighboring property before anyone caught it. The neighbor, an older rancher named Aldous Pruitt, came riding in at mid-morning with 4 of his men, and a very specific kind of energy that Rowena had seen before in men who felt wronged and had already decided whose fault it was. She was in the yard when he arrived. Cutter was still out finding the last of the strays. Aldous Pruitt pulled up and looked at her with the particular expression of a man who had expected to find the person in charge and found instead a woman. "Where's Drain?" he said. "Out on the west pasture," Rowena said. "He'll be back within the hour. In the meantime, you can speak to me." She kept her voice level. "I'm his wife." Pruitt's jaw shifted. "He just got married," she agreed. "That's the woman then," said one of the men behind him, not quietly enough. "I am," Rowena said, looking at the man directly. Then she looked back at Pruitt. "How many head came through?" he told her. She did the math and told him, without hesitation, what the grazing compensation would be based on the county standard, and that Cutter Drain would personally account for any damage to the neighboring property's grass cover, and that she would have Fenn ride the fence line today to identify the failure point and have it repaired by sundown. Pruitt looked at her for a long moment. He had come prepared for an argument, and she had removed his argument by simply being more prepared than he was. "All right," he said in the slightly deflated tone of a man who'd been expecting to be louder about something. He rode out. The man who had said, "That's the woman," then, didn't look at her on the way. When Cutter came in that evening and she told him what had happened, he stood in the kitchen doorway and listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "You quoted him the county standard, yes. How do you know the county standard?" "I looked it up," she said. "Your father's county almanacs are in the office. The compensation rates are in the agricultural supplement from 3 years ago. They haven't changed." He was quiet for a moment. "Pruitt's been on this land for 30 years, he said. "I know," she said. "He's also been overcharging you on boundary grazing fees for at least 2 of them. It's in your records." Cutter stood in the doorway and looked at her. Something moved in his expression that she was beginning to recognize. The recalibration of a man who has made an assessment and is updating it. "I'll look at those records," he said. "I already marked the relevant pages," she said. "They're on your desk." He looked at her for another long moment. Then he came the rest of the way into the kitchen and sat down, and something about the way he sat, less careful than usual, less contained, told her that she had, without entirely planning to, passed some threshold she hadn't known existed. What she hadn't expected was how hard it would be to stay wary of a man who kept not being what she'd expected. She had told herself a clear story when she agreed to this. This is an arrangement. He is a stranger. You are here for practical reasons, and you will remain practical. Don't mistake competence for character. Don't mistake reliability for warmth. The problem was Cutter Drain was making her story difficult to sustain. There was the matter of the dog. A stray had turned up on the property in Rowena's 3rd week. A thin, ragged heeler mixed with a gimpy left leg and an expression that suggested a great deal of recent hardship. She'd been feeding it scraps without saying anything, which she'd assumed was not a secret she was keeping particularly well. One morning she came out to find a proper dog bowl on the porch, filled with water, with a note tucked under it in Cutter's economical handwriting. "Fenn says her leg might need looking at. I'll have Doc Reese check it next time he's out." She stood on the porch and read the note twice. She didn't say anything to Cutter about it at dinner. But the next morning when she set his coffee on the table, she set it exactly the way she'd observed he liked it. Strong, no sugar, the cup positioned so the handle faced him. He noticed. He didn't comment, but she saw it register. There was also the matter of Praith, the younger of the two hands, who was 19 years old and had come to Kettle Basin from a situation Rowe gathered had been difficult without knowing the specifics. He was earnest in a way that hadn't been beaten out of him yet, which she found both endearing and worrying, because the world had a way of addressing that kind of earnestness eventually. She was in the kitchen one afternoon when she heard Cutter talking to Prace in the yard. She wasn't trying to listen. The window was open. Prace had made a mistake with the shearing count, a significant one. Cutter's voice was quiet. She heard him ask Prace to walk him through how it had happened. She heard Prace explain, stumbling through it, obviously terrified. She heard Cutter listen without interrupting, and then she heard Cutter say, "Okay, you're going to recount every flock record for the next 2 months and go over them with Fen at the end of each week. And next season you're going to shadow Fen through the whole shearing process before you work it alone." A pause. "You're not letting me go?" Prace said, in the voice of someone who has been let go before for less. "You made a mistake," Cutter said. "Not a habit. There's a difference." Rowena stood in the kitchen and looked at the wall. She went back to the bread she was making. She didn't say anything about it to Cutter, but she stopped reinforcing her defenses quite so carefully after that. The night that changed things was a Friday in late September, and it started with rain. Rowena had been in the office going over the supply invoices when the storm came in. She'd been expecting it. The sky had been building all afternoon, that particular greenish quality that meant the weather meant business. But it came faster than she'd expected and harder. She heard the hands shouting in the yard and looked out to see them moving the horses to the covered paddock, and she looked for Cutter among them and didn't find him. She found Fen at the barn door, water streaming off his hat brim. "Where is he?" she asked. "Newborn lamb in the north pen," Fen said. "Eew's having trouble. He's been in there since mid-afternoon." She took the lantern from the hook and went. She found Cutter on his knees in the wet straw, working with a steadiness and patience that she recognized as the kind that comes not from calm, but from the decision to be calm, which is harder and more real. The ewe was down and struggling, and the situation was serious. He didn't look up when she came in. She sat down on the other side of the pen, positioned the lantern where it would help, and said nothing. She stayed. She knew something about livestock in difficulty. She'd seen it on her father's farm, helped when she could. She passed instruments when Cutter needed them. She held the lantern steady when the angle mattered. She didn't speak unless he asked her something, and he asked her things precisely when he needed her and trusted her to manage them without instruction, which was, she was realizing, how Cutter Drain operated about everything. He trusted demonstrated competence. He didn't issue more instructions than were necessary. The lamb made it. It took nearly 2 hours and came right at the point where Rowena had privately stopped expecting it to. But it came. Cutter sat back in the straw and put his hands on his knees and looked at the small wet animal for a long moment without saying anything. She let the silence be. She understood it. After a while, he said, "First lamb of the season." "I know," she said. She didn't know that specifically, but she understood what he meant. "The ewe is 7 years old," he said. "She's been in this property longer than I have." She looked at him. He was still watching the lamb. "Did your father breed her?" she asked. "No, I bought her as a yearling. First purchase I made when I took the property over," he exhaled. "She's difficult every season. Never an easy birth. I keep meaning to rotate her out, but you don't, but I don't." Rowena looked at this man, kneeling in wet straw at 10 o'clock at night, because he had been here since mid-afternoon and hadn't left, who kept a difficult animal, because she was the first thing that had been his, who had said, "I hate losing things," without ever saying the words. "Come inside," she said. "I'll put coffee on." He got to his feet slowly. He looked at her in a way he hadn't looked at her before. Not the assessing quality, not the careful measurement she'd come to recognize, but something underneath those things, something more direct and more unguarded, like a man who has forgotten momentarily to manage his own expression. "You didn't have to stay," he said. "No," she agreed, and picked up the lantern and walked toward the barn door. He followed. She made coffee, and I sat at the kitchen table, and the storm worked itself out against the windows, and neither of them said much. But they stayed there together. For better than an hour, the lamp between them, and Rowena understood that something had passed between them in that pen that had nothing to do with contracts or arrangements, or the family debt that had brought her here. She didn't have a name for it. She didn't push it away. The morning after, she was up before him. She started the stove and had breakfast ready when he came in from checking on the ewe and the lamb at first light. He stopped in the doorway when he saw the table. "You didn't need to," he said. "I know," she said. "Sit down." He sat. They ate. He didn't speak about the night before, and she didn't either, which felt like respect rather than avoidance. But something was different. They both knew it. And the difference sat between them at the breakfast table, with a presence and a weight that was, in its own strange way, more honest than anything they'd yet found language for. When Fen came in halfway through, with a problem about the water supply to the north pasture, Cutter dealt with it without leaving the table, and when Fen finished explaining, Cutter glanced at her, almost without meaning to. She said, without being asked, "The north line runs through the old supply order from August. I was going to flag that. There's a repair listed that doesn't match the current work log." Fen looked at her. Cutter said, "How much?" "Enough to matter," she said. "I'll sort it today." Fen walked out with the expression of a man who had revised an opinion he hadn't known he held. The trouble arrived on a Wednesday, 3 weeks later, and its name was Leonard Galt. She heard about Galt from a woman named Beatrice Orr, who lived on the neighboring property to the west, and who had ridden over on the pretense of returning a borrowed preserving pot, but whose actual purpose Rowena understood the moment she came through the door and accepted the coffee offered to her, and sat down at the kitchen table with something tight around her mouth. "I don't know how much Cutter has told you," Beatrice said. "Tell me what you know," Rowena said. Beatrice told her. Leonard Galt was a landman, which was the frontier term for a category of person that was also called a speculator and also called a predator depending on who was talking and how honest they were being. He had arrived in Harwick County 8 months ago and had been acquiring property through a combination of purchase debt and legal pressure. He had bought out 4 operations in the Western Basin in the past year alone, all of them through the same mechanism. He found a weakness in the title, an irregular survey, an old unpaid lien, a recording error, and used it to file a competing claim that cost the original owners more to fight than to surrender. "He's been asking about Kettle Basin specifically," Beatrice said. "My husband heard it at the feed store in town last week. Galt's man has been at the county recorder's office twice in a month." Something cold moved through Rowena that she didn't let show. "What kind of questions?" "Survey questions," Beatrice said. "The original boundary filing for the drain property." After Beatrice left, Rowena went to the office. She pulled out every land document in the cabinet. She found the original grant again, the one she'd set aside in the first week, and she spread it on the desk alongside the 2 survey amendments that had been filed in the years following. She began to read. She was systematic about it. She read every document twice. She noted every reference. She cross-referenced the boundary descriptions against each other. She found it in the 3rd document, a survey amendment filed in 1874 by a county clerk named Reeves. The western boundary of the drain property was described differently in that amendment than it had been in the original 1857 grant. The original referenced the spring line at Calder Creek's upper fork. The 1874 amendment referenced the lower fork. 2 words, 17 years apart. And between those 2 forks, if you trace the line on the survey map, was a strip of land approximately 80 yards wide along the full western boundary. 80 yards that contained the only reliable water source on the property's western edge. Water that, if it fell outside the legal boundary of Kettle Basin, would transform Galt's neighboring acquisitions from marginal land into something significantly more valuable. She was still sitting at the desk with the documents spread in front of her when Cutter came in. He took one look at her face and said, "What did you find?" She told him. He sat down across from her and read both documents himself, slowly. She watched his face while he read. He had the same quality she'd observed in the barn, the ability to process something serious without letting the seriousness outpace him to feel the weight of a thing and keep thinking anyway. When he finished, he set both papers on the desk and was quiet for a moment. "Who filed the 1874 amendment?" she asked. "Reeves," he said. "County clerk." He paused. "His son-in-law works for Galt." The room felt different. "He's been planning this," Rowena said. "He's been planning this for a while," Cutter said. "This is not a coincidence." She looked at the documents. We nodded slowly. "There's a man in Harwick, Holt Alderman. He's been practicing county law for 30 years. If anyone knows how to argue an original survey against a fraudulent amendment, it's him." "Is he trustworthy?" Cutter looked at her. "Why?" "Because Galt has money," she said. And money tends to find the people who can be found. He was quiet. I've known Alderman for 15 years, he said. He's an honest man. Then we go tomorrow morning, she said. He looked at her again with that expression, the recalibration, the readjustment of an estimate. But this time there was something else underneath it. Something that looked like gratitude, and also like something more than gratitude. Something she didn't examine too closely yet, he said. We should copy those documents before we take them anywhere, she said, picking up the original grant, both of them. And I want them stored somewhere separate from this office, Rowena. She looked up. You said we, he said. Yes, she said. I did. He held her gaze. And the thing that had been building quietly in the kitchen and in the barn and at the breakfast table got a little larger, a little more real, like something finding its shape in the dark. Alderman was a small man with a large desk and the particular quality of stillness that comes from having heard every kind of trouble and refused to be impressed by it. He read both survey documents without speaking. He set them down. He read them again. The 1874 amendment is irregular, Cutter said. I can see that, Alderman said. Isaiah Reeves was the county clerk in 1874. He set his glasses on the desk. I knew Isaiah Reeves. He was not a careless man. Meaning? Rowena said. Meaning if there's an error in this document, someone put it there. What's our legal position if Galt files a competing claim? Alderman tapped the original grant. Your strongest argument is the 1857 document. It predates the amendment by 17 years and was properly filed and recorded. If the amendment can be shown to be fraudulent, the original boundary description controls. He paused. The question is evidence. Suspicion is not evidence. What kind of evidence would establish fraud? Rowena asked. Documentation of intent. A communication, a record, something that places Reeves in deliberate contact with a party that would benefit from the boundary change. He looked at Cutter. Have you been through your father's records, original correspondence from that period? Not completely, Cutter said. Do it today, Alderman said. Then he opened his desk drawer and set a paper in front of them. I received this from the county recorder this morning as a professional courtesy. He paused. Galt filed a competing claim on the Western Strip 4 days ago. The silence in the office was complete. He moved fast, Rowena said. He'd been ready for a while, Cutter said. His voice was level. His hand on the desk edge had gone white at the knuckles. He waited until he thought I was distracted. Rowena thought. He thought a new wife would occupy you. She didn't say it. She looked at Alderman. We file a counterclaim today, she said. And we go through every document on that property before nightfall. They rode back in focused silence. Fenn was in the yard. He looked at their faces and said, without being asked, what do you need? No one goes near the office, Cutter said. Nothing in or out without me or Rowena present. Fenn didn't ask questions. Done, he said. They worked through the old crates in the back of the office together, Cutter on one side of the desk and Rowena on the other, both of them moving with the speed of people operating under a deadline. The documents were dusty and in no order. She went through cattle records, supply invoices, correspondence with a bank in the capital that had been paid off in 1869. Cutter worked through his father's personal files with a carefully neutral expression that she understood meant there were things in those files he'd deal with separately, later when she wasn't watching. It was Rowena who found it. It was at the bottom of the second crate, folded inside a letter addressed to Cutter's father in a hand she didn't recognize, postmarked from the county surveyor's office, dated August 1874. She read the first paragraph. Then she read it again. Cutter. He was across the desk before she finished saying his name. The letter was from the original county surveyor, a man named Paris, to Cutter's father. It described a conversation Paris had had with Isaiah Reeves in the summer of 1874, in which Reeves had asked him to adjust the boundary description in the Drain Property Amendment. Paris had refused. He had written to warn Cutter's father. The letter named the party who had made the request through Reeves, a landman operating out of the Eastern Territories with significant holdings to the west of Kettle Basin. Not Galt himself, Galt's grandfather. This had been attempted before Galt was old enough to know what land meant. The Galt family had been trying to acquire this water source since before Cutter had been born. He inherited it, Rowena said quietly. This wasn't his idea. He just picked it back up. My father never told me, Cutter said. His voice was stripped down. He never mentioned this once. He may have thought it was settled, she said. Paris refused. Your father may have believed that was the end of it. Cutter set the letter on the desk and put his hands flat beside it. He looked at it without speaking. "This is what Alderman needs," Rowena said. She watched him take the thing in, the full scope of it. A man who had built something careful and decent on land that had been targeted before he was old enough to hold it, by a family that had passed the intention down the way some families passed down property. "He's not going to stop," Cutter said. "No," she agreed. "So we don't give him a reason to think he can win." He looked at her. "You sound certain. I have the 1857 grant, the Paris letter, the Reeves family connection to Galt, and a pattern of interference spanning 40 years, she said. "I'm certain about the evidence. The rest is Alderman's job." Something moved in Cutter's face. "When did you start thinking like a lawyer?" "I started thinking like a woman who has had to argue for things her whole life," she said. "It's the same skill." They took the Paris letter to Alderman that afternoon. He read it standing up. He set it on his desk. He set it next to the original grant and the 1874 amendment and looked at all three together. "This," he said, "is a pattern," Rowena said. Alderman looked at her over his folded glasses with the first unguarded appreciation she'd seen from him. "How did you know to look for it?" "I was being systematic," she said, "and I was angry." Alderman's mouth moved toward something. "Anger and method together," he said. "That's what wins cases." He filed the counterclaim that afternoon and attached the Paris letter as supporting evidence. He told them Galt would escalate. He told them to watch their supply contracts, their water access, anything that could be squeezed. He was right. The pressure came within a week. Galt had reached the Harwick Savings Bank and purchased an old note from Cutter's father's estate, a modest remaining balance, and was calling it due immediately on a technicality in the original loan language. The amount was manageable, but the timing was precise, designed to land at the worst possible moment, when attention and resources were both stretched thin. Rowena found out when the rider came from Alderman's office. Cutter was out on the East Ridge. She read the message and saddled her own horse without asking anyone and rode out to find him. She found him at the edge of the timberline with Fen and 2 dogs. And he saw her coming, and she watched his body change, the way you can see a person brace before they know what's coming. She handed him the message without preamble. He read it. His face went very still. "How bad?" Fen asked. "Manageable," Rowena said before Cutter could speak. Both men looked at her. "The amount is covered by the shearing advance from last month. It will be tight, but the accounts hold." She looked at Cutter. "I checked this morning." He looked at the message in his hand, then at her. "You checked this morning?" "I check every week," she said. "You know that." He was quiet, and something moved through him that she'd come to recognize. Not defeat, which was what Galt wanted, but the deeper, harder thing that replaces defeat, when a person has something worth protecting and someone standing beside them. "He wants us rattled going into that courtroom," he said. "I know what he wants," she said. "We're not going to give it to him." Fen looked between them with an expression he'd stopped trying to conceal. Rowena didn't acknowledge it. She turned her horse. "I'm going to town," she said. "What for?" Cutter asked. "To handle the bank," she said. "And then I'm going to talk to the Orr family of the Calder Ridge operations. You've helped half the county quietly for years. I think it's time the county showed up for you." Cutter looked at her. "Character witnesses." "Alderman mentioned them," she said. "We just haven't moved on it. Galt has been telling his version of who you are. Someone should tell the true one." She turned and rode. Behind her she heard Fen say something low, and she heard Cutter's response, not the words but the tone. Something quieter than his usual register, something surprised. She kept riding. There was work to do. Beatrice Orr said yes before Rowena finished asking. Her husband, a lean, weathered man named Cal, shook Rowena's hand and said they'd been looking for an occasion to say out loud what they knew about Cutter Drain, and this was as good an occasion as any. She had 4 families committed by the time she rode home, and the bank draft handled, and something in her chest that she recognized distantly as a feeling she hadn't felt in a long time. The specific satisfaction of a person who has found the place where what they're capable of meets something that actually needs it. Cutter was on the porch when she got back. He took her horse's bridle as she dismounted, and they stood close in the way they'd been standing close lately, which wasn't incidental anymore. 4, she said. Possibly 5. He shook his head slowly, not negatively. The way a person shakes their head when they don't have language for what they're feeling. He was looking at her with the direct quality she'd first read as cold and had slowly come to understand was the opposite. The attention of a man who takes nothing for granted and means everything he notices. "I don't know what I did to deserve this," he said. "You didn't do anything specific," she said. "You were just consistently who you are, for years." Without an audience, she looked at him. That's not nothing. For most people, that's everything. He was quiet, and then he reached out and took her hand and held it. Not as a beginning of something else, just held it, the way you hold something you're not ready to put down. She let him. The morning of the hearing, the courthouse in Harwick was more crowded than she'd expected. The families were there. The Orrs, the Calders, two others who had ridden in that morning without being asked. Because word in a county like this moves the way water moves, finding every channel available. Price was there, in a clean shirt that didn't quite fit, standing near the back wall. When Cutter saw him, he stopped walking. Price looked at the floor. "Figured you might need someone to say what kind of man you are," Price said. "I got something to say about that, if it helps." Cutter was quiet for a moment. "It helps," he said. Galt was already inside, with two lawyers from the Capitol, whose suits said everything about how seriously he was taking this. He looked at Rowena when she came in. She looked back without arrangement. He looked away first. Alderman was methodical and brilliant in the way of a person who has spent 30 years for the precise case they now have in front of them. He laid out each piece of evidence in sequence: the 1857 grant, the 1874 amendment, the handwriting irregularity Alderman's document examiner had identified, the Reeves family connection to Galt, and then, with the weight of 40 years behind it, the Paris letter. Galt's lawyers objected twice. The judge overruled them both times. When Alderman called character witnesses, Cal Orr described the season 3 years past, when Cutter Drain had sent two of his hands to help bring in the Orr family's hay after Cal broke his leg in August, and the weather was turning. He described Cutter sending the men without being asked and without charging anything, and refusing to accept payment afterward. Beatrice described the winter 2 years ago, when the Orrs' youngest had been sick with a lung fever, and Cutter had ridden to Harwick himself for the medicine, because it was faster than sending anyone else. One of the Calder Ridge men described a boundary dispute that Cutter had resolved in the neighbor's favor when he could have taken it to court and won, because the rightful answer was clear, and the legal answer wasn't, and Cutter Drain apparently saw no meaningful difference between those two things. Price described being given a second chance when no one else in the county would have given him one. Then Alderman called Rowena. She walked to the front of the room with her hands steady and sat down and looked at the judge and waited. Alderman asked her about the marriage arrangement. She told the truth, all of it, with nothing softened. The debt, her family's situation, the conversation at her parents' kitchen table, where Cutter had told her explicitly she could refuse. What he had offered, what he had not asked for, how she had decided. Galt's lawyer stood for cross-examination. He was smooth the way men are when they've learned that direct attacks tend to backfire. "Mrs. Drain," he said pleasantly, "wouldn't you characterize the circumstances of your marriage as coercive, given the financial pressure on your family?" "I would characterize the circumstances as difficult," Rowena said. "The financial pressure was from the debt, not from my husband. He told me I could refuse, and I believe he meant it." "But you didn't refuse," the lawyer said. "No," she said, "I didn't. Because I spoke with him first and determined he was an honest man making an honest offer." She paused. "I have found no evidence since then that I was wrong about that. I have found a considerable amount of evidence that I was right." The lawyer tried 2 more approaches. She answered both the same way, accurately, without aggression, with the specific clarity of a person who has decided what the truth is and sees no reason to dress it differently. He sat down. Under the table, Cutter's hand found hers. She didn't look at him. She looked at the judge, but she held on. The recess lasted 38 minutes. She sat in the corridor with Cutter beside her, and the county families ranged around them and nobody talked much. At one point, Cutter, quietly, "He's going to rule for us." She looked at him. "You don't know that." "No," he said. "But I know we told the truth and every person in that room could hear it." She looked at the courthouse door. "That has to count for something," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said quietly, the way he said things he meant most, "I didn't plan for you. When I made this arrangement, I told myself it was practical, that it would be a fair exchange and I would manage the operation properly and that would be the end of it." He looked at their hands. "I didn't expect you to become the thing that made sense of everything else." She looked at him. "Stay," she said. He met her eyes. "That's why I stayed," she said. "Not because of the debt or the contract or you had nowhere else to go. Because you show up. Because you don't quit on things that are worth not quitting on. Because when you said I could refuse, you meant it, and I knew you meant it, and that was the realest thing anyone had offered me in years." She paused. "That's why." Cutter Drain, who was not a man given to visible feeling, looked at her with something in his face so unguarded that she had to look at the courthouse door rather than at it directly. He held her hand. They waited. The judge ruled in favor of the original 1857 boundary description. The 1874 amendment was found to be procedurally fraudulent. The Paris letter corroborated by document analysis and the Reeves family connection. Galt's claim was dismissed. The water source, the western strip, the full boundary of Kettle Basin, confirmed as Drain property. Galt left without speaking to anyone. His lawyers followed. Rowena watched them go. What happened in the courtroom after was quieter than you might expect. People from the county didn't celebrate loudly. What they did was shake Cutter's hand, one by one, and look at Rowena with the particular directness of people who have updated an opinion they're glad to update. Beatrice hugged her. Cal Orr said, "Glad it came out right, with the economy of a man who doesn't say things he doesn't mean." Price stood against the back wall with his hat in both hands and his jaw working. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he pulled himself together and came forward and shook Cutter's hand without saying anything, and that was enough. Alderman told them quietly that the Reeves family connection and the fraudulent amendment would likely be referred to the state attorney general, that there would be further proceedings, that they should expect to testify again. "We'll be there," Rowena said. Cutter looked at her. "We'll be there," he agreed. The drive home was different from every drive they'd taken before. The weight was gone. The specific gravity of everything they'd been carrying, the documents, the legal threat, the quiet determination of the past weeks, had lifted, and what remained in its place was lighter and more permanent. They drove for a while without speaking, which was a different kind of silence now. The silence of two people who have arrived somewhere. Then Cutter said, "The North Pasture water system needs replacing before winter." She looked at the road. "I know. I put it in the November supply order." "When?" "Last week." He was quiet, and then he made a sound she'd heard from him only once before in the barn after the lamb had come through, low and real and coming from somewhere that didn't usually get air. She started laughing too. Not about anything specific, just about the cumulative relief of it, and they drove the rest of the way to Kettle Basin like that. The late afternoon light long and warm across the basin floor, and the horses steady under it. By winter, the ranch was different, not visibly. The sheep were the same sheep. The fences were the same fences. Fen still brought problems to the kitchen table with a regularity that Rowena had come to think of as a form of affection. Prey still thanked her for things twice before remembering to be less obvious about it. The dog's leg had healed, and she had attached herself to Rowena specifically, which Cutter observed without comment, but which Rowena noticed he never did anything to discourage. On a morning in early December, Rowena walked the south pasture line while Cutter checked the upper water access. The grass was winter yellow, and the air was cold and clear, and the kind of morning that doesn't apologize for what it is. She could hear Price singing something to himself near the barn in the distance, badly, and without apparent concern for the quality of the performance, and the sound of it made her smile without thinking about it. Cutter came down the slope and fell into step beside her. They walked the line together in the particular way they did things together now, without needing to negotiate it, without announcement, just moving in the same direction at the same pace. He stopped at the corner post and looked out at the basin spread below them. "I've been thinking," he said. "About what?" "About the fact that I spent 15 years managing this place alone and thought that was the natural state of things." He looked at the basin. "I didn't know what I was missing. I'd convinced myself there wasn't anything to miss." She stood beside him, and now? He turned and looked at her, the way he looked at things he'd decided about. Completely, without reservation. "Now I know," he said. She looked at him. This man who had come to her family's door with a business arrangement and a plain silver ring, and had turned out to be the most honest person she'd ever known, who had shown up for things quietly and without audience for years, who had held her hand in a courthouse corridor and told her she had become the thing that made sense of everything else. She had been afraid. She had been angry. She had told herself every practical story she could find to keep herself from wanting something that hadn't been offered, and then it had been offered. honestly, without performance, one careful day at a time. "I know too," she said. He reached out and took her hand, and they stood there in the cold December morning with the basin below them and the sky above them enormous and clear. And Rowena thought about a woman who had said, "I'll go," with her voice steady and her hands shaking, and had believed she was choosing the least bad option available. She had been wrong about that. She had been choosing this.